Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're charting a course back to early 20th century Thailand. We're going to explore the beginnings of the Wufu steamship company.
That's right. And we're basing this on some really fascinating academic work analyzing Chinese newspapers from Thailand back then.
Exactly. So, if you're interested in, say, global trade, or maybe the role Chinese diaspora communities play, or even just the history of shipping, well, this deep dive has some, I think, quite surprising insights.
Yeah, we'll unpack how Wufu got started and, its place in the whole shipping scene of that era.
And our main source, like you said, is this analysis of Thai Chinese newspapers. It's like opening a window onto the commercial life back then.
A really unique perspective. So our mission today, basically, is to get a handle on Wufu Steamship Company's origins.
Right. Its establishment, its early days, all within that Sino-Time maritime trade picture in the early 1900s.
Let's set the scene first. Early 20th century Asia, shipping-wise,
Hmm.
the paper mentions Western companies were pretty dominant.
Yeah, that comes through clearly. After their big expansion in the 19th century, they sort of had the upper hand. Why was that?
Well, mostly it came down to two things. Capital, just having more money, and, crucially, more experience. They'd been running steamships for longer.
That makes sense. A head start, really. But the paper also talks about Chinese-owned companies starting up in Thailand then. How did they manage?
They did. You see names like Huasiam Steamship Company, Chung Siam Steamship Company emerging. They were often backed by Chinese merchants, both local in Thailand and, overseas Chinese.
So, using their own network.
Exactly. Maybe less experience initially compared to the Western firms, but those community and trade connections were, well, vital.
It's interesting, too, that the paper highlights how little research there actually is on these specific China-Thailand shipping routes for this time.
Absolutely.
Oh.
Which makes this kind of deep dive using these newspapers really valuable for filling in those gaps in our understanding of regional trade.
Okay, so to really grasp how Wufu emerged, we need to talk about these Chinese newspapers in Thailand. They weren't just like reporting news, were they?
Not at all. You have to remember the context. Huge Chinese migration to Thailand, especially the Teochew community. By the early 1900s, maybe almost 10% of Thailand's population was Chinese.
Wow, that's significant.
It is. And these newspapers, they were often more than just news. Many were started by intellectuals, even revolutionaries, pushing democratic ideas. Politics was a big part of it.
So papers like the Hansing Daily News from 1903 or the Meenam Daily News a few years later.
Right? They had clear agendas, but it wasn't all one view.
Ah, okay. The paper mentions pro-monarchist papers too.
Yeah, reflecting the different currents within the community and politics back in China and in Thailand itself. You have papers like South Public News, South Daily News, Lingko Bao, Huasiam Daily News, representing different viewpoints.
Sounds like a lively scene, but maybe a bit unstable. The paper says a lot of them didn't last long in the 20s and 30s.
That's very true. Financial problems were common. Running a newspaper is expensive, even with a decent readership.
And who was reading them? Really?
Mostly Chinese merchants, intellectuals, people connected to the Chinese schools. They were interested in Chinese politics, of course, but also things like ads for goods from Shanghai and Hong Kong.
So these papers were kind of knitting the community together economically and politically, connecting them back to China, too.
Exactly. Vital information channels, promoting business, maintaining links, which brings us to the shipping ads themselves.
Right, the steamboat departure dates and arrival dates, basically shipping schedules published for everyone to see.
Pretty straightforward format usually. Ship's name, where it left from, where it's going, the date, and the company running it.
Essential info for anyone moving goods or people.
The paper gives that example from Liang Cao Bao in 26. Chung Siam Steamship, direct to Shantou, 10 baht fare. Gives you a real sense of the cost.
Yeah, 10 baht.
Mm.
And Chung Siam, it says, was owned by Tan Limbi, son of Tan Chi Huan.
Yes, a prominent family. They had 6 ships running back and forth between Bangkok and Shantou about 4 times a month. Pretty regular service.
And agents listed in Hong Kong and Shantou, too. Shows the network. 6 ships is quite a fleet for back then.
It represents a serious investment. And it was all under the umbrella of Tan Chi Wan's main company, Hong Li & Co. Part of a bigger family business, it seems.
Now, even before Chung Siam, there was another Chinese company on this route, wasn't there? Huasiam.
Yes, Huasiam Steamship Company, or the Siam Overseas Chinese General Trading Steamship Joint Stock Company. Quite a mouthful. They actually started the Bangkok-Shantou route for Chinese firms back in 1905.
What prompted them?
Seems as dissatisfaction with the Western companies, feeling they had a monopoly. Chinese merchants wanted more control over their own shipping.
Makes sense. And they started big.
8 ships, covering routes not just to Shantou, but Malaysia, Singapore, Vietnam, Hong Kong. 4 ships were mainly on that key Bangkok-Shantou run. They even had an office in Shantou.
Quite ambitious. But the paper says they hit problems early on.
Yeah, management issues apparently. Had to stop after only 3 years. But they managed to restructure, get more capital, and restarted in 1909.
And the second time worked out better.
Much better, it seems. Especially because Shantou merchants apparently started using them almost exclusively for shipping to Thailand. That loyalty within the network really helped.
So these newspapers don't just tell us about specific companies, they give a snapshot of the whole port, right? Like for March 1924.
Exactly. Using the Siamese Capital Daily, the earliest one they found with ads, they analyzed that 1 month, March 1924. Gives us a sense of the traffic.
And it was busy. 40 departures from Bangkok in just that month.
It really was. And look at the destinations. 12 to Shantou, that's the most. 11 to Chantaburi in Thailand itself. Then Hong Kong, Singapore, and even one to Haikou. Bangkok was definitely a hub.
And who was running these ships?
A real mix. You had the big British names, Jardine and Swire, the French shipping company. Kuching Muniang, which was Malaysian but with British money. And this Yeshu Strait steamship company, plus chartered ships.
What does chartered mean here exactly?
Basically rented. The company would hire a ship, often with its crew, for a specific trip or time. More flexibility than owning, perhaps.
Okay. And Shantou being 30% of departures really jumps out. That link was so strong.
Hugely important. And then look at arrivals for the same month. 60 ships came in. That's 1.5 times the departures.
So more coming in than going out that month. Interesting. Where from?
Again, quite varied. Hong Kong, Annam, Chantaburi, Shantou, Singapore, Haikou. Even a couple from places called Jilu and Hua Guid. Wider reach on the inbound side, it seems.
And the big sources for arrivals were?
Singapore was the biggest, 42%. Then Shantou and Hong Kong tied at 20% each. Those 3 were clearly the main arteries feeding into Bangkok.
And the company's bringing them in.
Same players, mostly. Jardine, Swire, Kuching Muniang, Yeshi Strait. But look at this. Chartered vessels were the biggest chunk of arrivals, 39%. Lots of non-regular or hired shipping coming in.
So the paper breaks down what these companies were doing that month.
Yeah, it gives us a bit more detail. Yashin Strait, for example, seemed focused on Chantaburi and Shantou for departures. But arrivals were mainly from Chantaburi and Singapore. Suggests maybe a local Bangkok company, perhaps less regular schedules internationally.
Okay. What about the big European firms?
Jardine looked pretty regular on the Shantou run, balanced departures and arrivals, plus Hong Kong links. Kuching Muniang seemed almost totally focused on the Bangkok-Singapore route, both ways. Really highlights that specific connection.
And Swire.
Swire had a wider net. Shantou, Hong Kong, Haikou routes, all active in both directions. They seemed quite diversified.
And the French company.
Only departures to Annam recorded that month. Suggests maybe that wasn't a core regular route for them, just an occasional thing, perhaps.
Okay, so this whole picture busy port mix of big international players, local Thai routes, strong China connections, emerging Chinese firms like Huasiam and Chongsiam. This is the world Wufu Steamship Company enters.
Exactly, that's the context.
Yeah.
So when does Wufu actually appear on the scene?
The paper pins it down to 1922, established in Bangkok by a Chinese merchant, Chen Zhenjing.
Okay, 1922. And their routes, where did they focus initially?
Primarily that really important Bangkok-Shantou link, and also Bangkok to Singapore,
Right.
targeting those key regional hubs.
And they seem to have done well pretty quickly. By the 30s and 40s, the paper says Wufu was one of the 2 main Chinese shipping companies in Thailand.
Yeah, that's quite a rise in a competitive field. There's a Japanese report cited from 1940.
Ah, yes, the trends of overseas Chinese in Siam. What does it say?
It confirms Wufu's position, and interestingly, it mentions they mainly used chartered Norwegian ships.
In Norwegian ships. Why might that be?
Good question. Maybe better charter rates, newer ships, or maybe flying a neutral flag like Norway's had advantages in that period. The paper doesn't speculate much, but it's a detail that stands out.
Definitely. And their routes mentioned in that report.
Bangkok to Hong Kong, Shantou, Hainan, and Singapore. Still those core connections.
And the other major Chinese company in that 1940 report was Chongsiam.
Yes. But interestingly, by then, Chongsiam seemed to be acting more as an agent for a Norwegian company called Treason, handling their routes between Hong Kong, Singapore, Shantou, and Bangkok.
So maybe Chongsiam shifted strategy, moving away from operating their own or chartered ships directly towards an agency model?
Could be. And there's another source from 1938, Takao Tamio's book.
Overseas Chinese affairs in Southeast Asia.
That's the one. It basically confirms the picture. Wufu chartering Norwegian ships for the key routes. And it gives details on Sheng Siam established 1910, 3 million baht capital, using chartered ships for Bangkok Hong Shantou. Reinforces their position as the big two Chinese players.
It's good to have that confirmation from multiple sources. Yeah. We shouldn't forget the smaller players either.
Right. The paper mentions guys like A.I. Cheng running the Singora-Bangkok coastal route or Su Kung Sing sailing between Bangkok and smaller ports like Bandung. They were part of the ecosystem, too.
Absolutely vital for that local coastal trade. Okay, so zooming out a bit, the paper brings in some context from Fujian province in China. Why is that relevant?
Well, Fujian was the ancestral home for many overseas Chinese, including, likely, many involved in shipping. And Fujian itself has this incredibly long maritime history. Think Zheng, his fleets.
Right, centuries of shipbuilding expertise.
But the Qing Dynasty sea bans kind of put a damper on things for a while. Then steamships arrive in the 19th century, seen in Fujian waters during the First Opium War. The paper says this was a strong stimulus.
Seeing these new, powerful ships must have been a shock and an inspiration.
Definitely. People like Lin Zexu noted their importance. Some merchants even tried to understand the technology, like Ding Gongshan building a small steamboat. There was interest early on.
And official efforts, too, like the Fujian Shipbuilding Bureau.
Yes, set up in Maui in 1866. They even brought in French experts. It was a serious attempt to build modern warships and commercial vessels.
But then the treaty ports opened, like Fuzhou and Xiamen. That must have changed things again.
Big time. Foreign steamship companies like Jardine and Swire moved in, competing directly with the traditional Chinese sailing junks. And then the Chinese government tried to compete back with the China Merchant Steam Navigation Company from 1873.
So a really complex mix of foreign competition, traditional shipping, and early Chinese attempts at modernization. What about this entrustment operation thing the paper mentions?
Zhenjing. Basically, Chinese ship owners registering their ships under foreign flags.
Why would they do that?
Seems it was often to avoid Chinese bureaucracy, maybe get smoother treatment internationally. A way to operate more freely, in a sense.
Interesting workaround. So private Chinese shipping in Fujian itself faced challenges before the Sino-Japanese War.
Yeah, competition from the big state-backed China Merchants Company plus government rules seemed to limit private ventures.
But things opened up a bit after that war.
Yes, restrictions on inland shipping eased up. That led to more small, private steamship companies starting in Fujian, in places like Xiamen and Fuzhou. But the paper stresses most were still pretty small and faced intense competition.
Okay, so this Fujian background helps us understand the world Chen Zhenjing came from, perhaps the kind of challenges and opportunities Chinese entrepreneurs saw in shipping.
Exactly. And speaking of Chen Zhenjing, the founder of Wufu, the paper doesn't just talk business. It highlights his philanthropy, too.
Right, beyond just running the shipping company. We know Wufu started in 1922, ran those key routes using chartered Norwegian ships.
But Chen Zhenjing himself was deeply involved in the Chinese community in Thailand, supporting education, helping during famines, lots of social welfare stuff.
A real pillar of the community, it sounds like.
Yeah, and involved in community affairs, even supported Sun Yat-sen's revolutionary movement back in China. Shows his connections and interests went beyond just business in Thailand.
And setting up things like a funeral home, free clinics, that really shows a commitment to the community's well-being.
Definitely paints a fuller picture of the man behind Wufu. Okay, so let's try and wrap this up. What are the main takeaways from this deep dive into Wufu's beginnings?
Well, I think it's clear Wufu emerged in a really dynamic, competitive maritime world in early 20th century Thailand. They had to find their place amongst powerful Western companies and other Chinese firms like Sheng Siam.
Their establishment in 1922, alongside Sheng Siam's continued presence, really marks a key phase in Chinese-owned shipping growth in that region.
And this growth was clearly fueled by the expanding Chinese communities and, importantly, the information networks these Chinese newspapers provided. You see that link between community, information, and business.
And for you listening, if you're tracking global trade or diaspora stories, this look at Wufu shows that entrepreneurial drive, the economic impact, but also the social contributions of these communities.
That detail about the Norwegian ships is also a reminder of how globalized shipping was even then with these complex chartering arrangements.
It really is. Yeah. So maybe a final thought for you to ponder.
Yeah, considering all the challenges, the competition the capital needed, What factors, what strategies do you think really allowed companies like Wufu to succeed and grow against those big international players in the 20th century?
Hmm. Maybe looking at how the political and economic ties between China and Southeast Asia changed over the following decades might give us some clues, something to think about.